I said before that the Quran is notoriously difficult to interpret and to understand, given that our knowledge of what it was and how it arose is so uncertain. So how can we be sure that, in fact, these people did really think of themselves as believers and that their movement included Jews and Christians? Are we maybe deluding ourselves, being misled by willful interpretation or misinterpretation of a couple of passages in the Quran? Well, to answer this question, I think we need to turn here to the documentary evidence from the 7th century. And there are various bits of documentary evidence that come in handy here and they're quite interesting. So for the idea that this was somehow a movement that was motivated by a religious impulse above all, some of the earliest documents, including coins, seem to confirm this. This picture shows when the new community expanded into the Near East, into Sasanian and Byzantine territory, it took over a lot of things, including the mints of these governments that had been there before. It took over the mints and the mint workers and the dies for the coins. And so after a few years, they started minting their own coins using the same mints and the same dies. And so what you see here is a coin which is exactly like a Sasanian silver dram. And you can see on the obverse the head of the great king here with distinctive hairdo. And on the reverse, you actually have a fire temple with two attendants on either side, not a very Muslim imagery at all. And it's got Middle Persian writing around here of various kinds in Pahlavi or Middle Persian, which was sort of the official language of Zoroastrianism and presumably of the Sasanian dynasty as well. And yet, you see here on the margin, there's a countermark, we might call it. They've taken the original die and they've added something. And this is in Arabic, and it says Bismillah, in the name of God. So this is, of course, a very common phrase in the Muslim tradition, but it shows that, you know, they're marking their presence by putting this countermark on the coins. And it's an explicitly religious slogan. Now, you can say, well, they were all these people in this expansion movement. There were a lot of people who just jumped on the bandwagon because you know, it was exciting. They could go conquer new lands. They could get plunder and booty and slaves and whatever they wanted. They really weren't interested in monotheism or anything else. That may be, but nonetheless, somehow the leadership of the movement expressed itself in this distinctively religious terminology, which I think helps to kind of reaffirm some of the ideas we find in the narrative tradition. That the movement was led by people, well, did they think of themselves as believers? Well, we find some inscriptions from the 7th century that seem to confirm that they thought of themselves this way, because we find some inscriptions that talk about the leader of the movement as the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the believers. So if he's the commander of this community, and it's the commander of the believers, presumably believers is what the community thought of itself as being. This is quite a famous inscription. Actually, it was first published, I think, in the 1950s by George Miles. It's found in Ta'if, sort of above Mecca, and the hills above Mecca. And it's an inscription commemorating the construction of a dam by the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or commander of the believers, Muawiyah, who ruled from 640 to 660, I think. And, oops, I think I just did the wrong thing. Oh, good, it came back. Somewhere you can see in here, Muawiyah, Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the believers. And then it goes on and talks more about the construction of the dam and who built it and so on. So that seems to kind of confirm the character of the movement as a believers' movement, that they thought of themselves as believers in the 7th century. Or we also find some papyri from the 7th century. Here's a scrap. You're going to see it several times today from the collections in Vienna. And one of the things we find on some of these papyri is when they give a date. You know, the dating system of Muslims today, if you see a date, it's the date of the Hijrah. It goes back to the Hijrah, the Prophet's migration from Mecca to Medina. But we don't find the word hijra in these inscriptions or in early datings. Not until about 300 of the Muslim era do we find it. What we find, though, in the 7th century are some documents that are dated in something called Qada al-Mu'mineen, the jurisdiction of the believers, which again emphasizes the idea that they're believers. And if you're an Arabist, you can see down here in the lower line here, the qaf is missing, but here's Da al-Mu'mineen. This is ila something, right? So we find a number of these documents with this dating form, the Qada al-Mu'mineen, referring to the jurisdiction of the believers, which means, well, their government was seen as the rule of the believers. Other evidence beyond the Quran for the idea that the movement was open, or shall we say non-confessional, included Jews and Christians as well as Quranic believers. There's a document, or what can we call it, the transcript of a document, which is found in the later narrative sources, but which every scholar who looks at this says this must be an actual transcript of something very, very old. It's usually called the Constitution of Medina, or the Ummah document, or the Sahifa, has various names. But one of the things it mentions is it lists a number of Jewish clans in Medina, Yathrib, who are part of this pact making up this, how this community is to be constructed. And it includes Jewish clans as part of the Ummah, as part of the community. It explicitly says that. So this seems quite clear that there were Jews who were considered in some way as part of this community. And from many 7th century literary texts in Syriac, so these are the Christian texts that are earlier than the Muslim literary sources, and they tell us sometimes about the beginnings of Islam. We know that many Christians served in the Umayyad court. They served in the Umayyad army. They served in the bureaucracy, sometimes even as what we would call the prime minister. John of Damascus is a famous one, served the Umayyad caliphs or emirs al-Mu'mineen in Damascus. But we have many, many references to this. Also in the Muslim sources we find, especially in poetry, we find references to Christians being part of what we usually think of as the Muslim armies in the 7th century. Even one passage, a very interesting one, where the Christian writer says these people came and they sent campaigns every year to the far horizons, and they conquered and they took lots of captives and brought back lots of booty. And among them there were many Christians, both from our sect and from the heretics, another Christian sect. So it seems like there was some kind of cooperation here between this new believers movement and many people in the Christian communities as well. Or another one, there was a bishop, an Armenian bishop in the 7th century named Sebeos. Someone using his name, scholars call this text pseudo-Sebeos. Someone wrote a chronicle and attributed it to Sebeos in the 7th century. And it gives us one of the very first descriptions of the career of the prophet in a very truncated, very brief, but it does talk about the prophet and how he was a teacher and taught them, his followers, the laws and so on. One of the things it says a little farther on, after the prophet has died, it talks about how they conquered Jerusalem. And it says they appointed as the first governor of Jerusalem a Jew. Now this factoid, this bit of information, is not confirmed in any of the Muslim sources or in any Christian source, other Christian source. One can ask, was this bishop, Christian communities in the 7th century were very strongly anti-Jewish. They engaged in a lot of anti-Jewish polemic. Maybe he didn't like these people, these new people, and he just wanted to discredit them, so he said they appointed a Jew as a way of just smearing them. But maybe they did appoint a Jew as the governor of Damascus, of Jerusalem. We don't know. We have no confirmation of this fact, but it's very suggestive in the light of all these other bits of evidence about some kind of symbiosis or cohabitation of the people we usually call Muslims, or believers from Arabia, and the Christian and maybe other communities of the Near East.